Midwest Whitetail is brought to you by Realtree, Hoyt Archery, Fuse Accessories, Muddy Outdoors, Cabela's, Trophy Rock, Scott Archery, Frigid Forage, Rocket Broadheads, Easton Arrows, Redneck Hunting Blinds, Quiet Cat, Non-Typical Wildlife Solutions, Deer Grow, Ozonics, Wilderness Athlete, Grizzly Coolers, RTP Outdoors, and Nikon.
Thanks for joining me today on Midwest Whitetail. Normally I'd be finishing up the poor man plot today, but we had a lot of rain over the weekend, so I'm waiting for things to dry out so I can get the tractor down in there and push all those trees out of the way. Like I said last week, this one was a bigger job than I expected. It was really a bulldozer job if you wanted to do it correctly. But we'll make it work, and we'll get back there again next week with the final steps on getting that poor man plot into shape. But in the meantime, on this episode, we're going to talk about blood trailing, and I want to go into a little bit about one of the new sponsors that we've got this season on Midwest Whitetail. In this first segment, I'm going to talk about blood trailing. There's so much to this topic that I'm sure I could do multiple episodes on this and may come back to it again with some more thoughts on tough trails and advanced tracking. But first, I'm going to start out with the basics and then kind of build on that. Let's talk first about mistakes that a lot of people make. The first one, I think, is they get so excited that they don't pay attention to exactly where the arrow hits or the reaction of the animal after the shot and where the animal goes. You have to keep your composure all the way through the entire encounter until the deer is, no longer visible, you can't hear it anymore. Then you can start to, put all the notes together in your head, and then you can start getting excited. So for example, the first thing I do is I try to get a real clean mental picture of where the arrow hit. Sometimes you're going to get deceived there because everything happens fast. The deer might duck at the sound of the shot, and you might get a high hit where you thought it was, a good clean shot. Sometimes they'll turn a little bit. Sometimes you'll hit a bone, like a leg bone, that'll deflect the arrow. So there's lots of stuff that can happen that kind of plays tricks with your mind, but try to lock in on exactly what you saw. Next thing is really mark the spot where you last saw the deer. So there can be situations where you don't get a lot of blood trail, and knowing as far away as possible where the deer went gives you a really good point of where you're going to start up the search if you can't follow the blood the whole way. I also listen for a long time. I've had deer that I recovered that I saw, believe it or not, 2 hours later. I had a morning hunt one time in Kansas where I shot a deer, and it was a little bit back. It was a liver hit, I believe, or somewhere in that neighborhood. And I stayed on stand because I knew that, the direction that the deer went, there was some chance that he might pop back out again, and I wasn't going to go after him right away anyway. So I just sat there and watched. And 3 hours later, I saw him walk across an open field. And when I got there to look for him later, there was no blood trail. And I'm sure that had I not stayed in that stand, I would not have found that deer, because he went down one ditch, a couple hours later, crossed an open field into another ditch, and that's where we found him dead. So keep your attention for as long as possible, and listen. Sometimes you'll hear other deer blowing in the direction where the deer went. Those are the preliminary things. Now let's get into the actual trailing itself. The most important step is knowing when to follow up. And you have the visual of the hit, and then you have the sign at the location of the hit that's going to give you those clues. By a sign, I mean the type of blood, and then hopefully if the arrow went through the deer, you can look at the arrow itself and see the color of the blood and any other types of matter that might be on the arrow that would help you to figure out what to do next. If you hit them in the lungs or the heart, you're going to get real bright red, almost a bright pinkish color to the blood. And if you hit them back a little bit further than that, let's say liver, you're going to get a really nice red, but it's not going to have that kind of pinkish, heavily oxygenated tint to it. And then if you get into muscle, you're going to have, the red blood. If you get back into the body cavity a little ways, you're going to start running into darker colored blood, almost a darker red, almost a brownish red color. And you may even end up getting small amounts of stomach matter or something like that on the arrow as well. The arrow might have a foul odor to it. That's going to help you to figure out what to do next. Sometimes you'll get a bunch of fat on the arrow, and that tells you, one thing that could possibly have happened, and that's typically a low hit, like a brisket hit. The arrow will be real greasy. So those are the types of things that you look for. If you've got obviously a double lung hit, real bright red blood, lots of blood trail, the rule of thumb is wait 30 minutes and then follow up. A lot of times you hear that deer go down or you see it crash if you made that kind of a good hit. You don't have to wait, obviously, at that point. If you get the bright red blood that you say, okay, this isn't the lung blood, this isn't the heart blood, and it's more like a liver or something like that would be typical of the red blood. That one you need to pull back on. Minimum of 3 hours before you take up that trail. I've seen liver hit deer that have lived as long as 4 hours. So you just have to be really careful on that one, that you don't pursue too soon. And then if the blood is brownish colored, or there's any stomach matter at all on the arrow, or you saw it hit back, that one you probably are going to be looking at least a 12-hour, 8 to 12 hours. They get sick pretty fast from that. They really don't bleed from those types of hits. They get what's called, I think it's a septic poisoning, which is basically blood poisoning. And it takes them a while to die from that. So it's not pleasant, and obviously that's not the kind of hit that we're trying to strive for. But you have to still handle it correctly so that you can recover that deer. When it comes to the actual search itself, you always want to stay with blood for as long as you possibly can. I always say that as soon as you give up the blood trail, that's the first step toward losing the animal. And so many twists and turns in the trail that if you say, well, he's going this direction, and then you say, okay, we know that, let's go look for the deer, they don't have to keep going on a straight line. So you don't want to assume that just because the general trail is in this direction, that's where the deer went. I like on the initial search no more than 2 people. You can stay a lot more coordinated with 2 people. One's on the trail, and one is more or less marking the last spot. And one, the one that stays back is doing the micro search, and then the one that moves a little bit ahead is looking for the bigger drops of blood. And between the 2 of them, usually they can work out a trail fairly quickly. If that doesn't result in finding the animal, the blood trail runs out and there's no clear indication of where to go next, that's when you call all your buddies in and you start the grid search. Basically what you do is you line your group up side by side, no further apart than where you can see the feet of the person next to you. If you go any wider than that, the deer can slip through the net. It can be laying underneath a brush pile and you just don't see it because you're too far apart. So you comb through the timber or the cover, whatever it may be. It might even be CRP switchgrass. And then the person on the one end stays in his spot. Everybody else loops across, and then they fan out again. And now this person is looking back towards the guy on the other side of him, and they work their way down across. The person on that side, now the far side stops and waits, and everybody flips around him, and then you go again. And you can basically, the guy on the end retraces his route down and back. And that way you didn't miss anything. And you can comb through a piece of cover very, very effectively this way. And a rule of thumb that I've always felt, and I've had it confirmed by a lot of different outfitters that I've talked to about this, is if you don't find the deer within about 300 yards, the odds of finding it really start dropping off fast. Beyond that, it gets a lot fuzzier because you can still find them on a single lung hit, for example. The deer, you might find that deer a long ways away. But in most cases, if it's a fatal hit, the deer is going to be dead within a quarter of a mile. We'll come back again in future episodes and we'll touch more on the tough tracking and some of the things that we've seen with hits that we thought were good but weren't, and what those, what exactly happened and what those trails look like, because that can be really interesting information too. We just need to, try to spread that out over a few episodes here and not hit it all at once. Well, that's it for the first segment here on blood trailing. Like I said, we'll come back and revisit this subject again in the future. Ozonics is a new sponsor this year on Midwest Whitetail, but we used the products quite extensively last season just to test them out. We always want to be careful that the sponsors that we have on the show and the products that we promote to our viewers are products that we really believe in, that we can feel good about, recommending. We don't want to sell out just for the sake of having more sponsors. We want to make sure that what we work with does the job. So we weren't real quick on the Ozonics, but we really did get comfortable with the product through last season. I used it in the redneck blind every single time I went in, and I would say that it made a significant difference in the number of deer that picked up our scent downwind of the blind. Without the Ozonics in the past, certain spots, if the deer got downwind, they'd pick us up. And you'd really notice that when the blind is out in the middle of a feeding area. It's a little bit harder to detect when you're hunting the edge of the timber and then the wind is blowing into the timber. But when you're out in the middle of the field with a blind and you see deer 360 degrees around the blind and you've got a window open and none of the deer have got their noses in the air, you know that this thing is working the way it's supposed to. And the rest of the guys that work for me in the office, they were using the Ozonics almost every single time they went into the tree. So we got a double test on it. How well does this work in the tree stand and how well does it work in the ground blind? And they all said to a person that it made a noticeable difference in the reaction of the deer that got downwind. I'd say they were calmer on the downwind side, and in some cases they would just sort of blow it off and continue on with their activities. Worst case scenario, they knew something was up and they would vacate, but never did they have deer get downwind and then snort and blow out. One thing that we want to touch on here is the new product that they've got for the 2016 season. And this new unit reportedly is 70, I think he said they produce 70 or 75% more ozone than the ones that we tested last year. So for the same size package, the same amount of gear in the tree, you get a 75% improvement in the amount of ozone showering down on you. And there's a lot of, you go to their website and you can learn a lot about how to use it and the best way to employ the units in the tree versus in the blind, and when the wind is blowing a certain way, how do you set up. So that's all the technical side of it that I'll let you do the research on their website. I just wanted to give our testimonial that we did test these out pretty extensively last season and got really comfortable with the product. And there was a lot of questions. People are constantly asking whether we believe in the ozone or the Ozonics or not. And the science is proven. I mean, people have been using ozone inside cars to remove the odor of cigarette smokers and all different kinds of situations where they're trying to deodorize different environments. So there's no question that the science works. So the only question was, does this technology translate into the hunting situation? Does the application work? And we got real comfortable with that last season, like I said. So don't be afraid to dive in and get yourself an Ozonics. We're going to be using them just about every time we go into the field this fall. Well, that's it for this week's show. Like I said, I hope to be back down in the valley finishing up my poor man plot next week, and we'll bring you some more information on what's going on in the whitetail woods, and at some point here we're going to start putting the cameras back out and seeing what these bucks are looking like as they're growing for this coming season. Well, I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Midwest Whitetail, and remember to always dream big.